morning, everyone. It is a great honor for me to moderate this session titled ASEAN Between the US and China, What Options Are Available? And my sincere thanks goes to the East Asia Foundation and the Asia Pacific Leadership Network, the APLN, of which many of us here are proud members, for bringing this distinguished panel of former foreign ministers and former senior diplomats and ambassadors from ASEAN countries as well as from the Republic of Korea to help us unpack some of the most consequential strategic questions facing ASEAN and the Southeast Asia region today. How has ASEAN navigated great power competition, and what has its track record been so far? What value does ASEAN offer to its member states in resisting a binary choice between the US and China while continuing to leverage the partnerships with the US, China, and other major powers for their national interests? And how should ASEAN be further strengthened and its work methods be further improved to enhance the region's collective resilience and preserve strategic autonomy? And is ASEAN becoming more or less relevant at a time of growing unilateralism by the great powers, fragmentation, and also contestations in regional politics as well as at the global level? So to start the discussion, we will have the first speaker, Kasit, PIROMYA, former foreign minister of Thailand, who is well known for speaking his mind about ASEAN's current challenges, as well as his earnest call for ASEAN to change. But of course, his criticisms come from somebody who knows ASEAN inherent structural challenges, hence his belief in the importance of exercising political leadership in an agency to steer ASEAN towards greater service of its people. And our second speaker is Dr. Marty NATALEGAWA. He is the former foreign minister of ASEAN. And to me, he is a statesman who carries ASEAN at heart throughout his career. He is the author of Does ASEAN Matter? A book in which I have a modest distinction of appearing in one of the photographs. That photograph captured one of the infamous moments in ASEAN history at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in 2012 in Phnom Penh, when they failed for the first time in history to issue a joint communique because of the disagreements over the South China Sea disputes. And I watched Marty navigate that storm firsthand, as well as many other storms, big and small, during my years at the ASEAN Secretariat. He is, in the truest sense, the ASEAN champion. And our third speaker joining us online is Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, a distinguished Vietnamese diplomat and former vice chair of the Vietnamese National Assembly's Foreign Affairs Committee. And her career spans diplomacy, education, and public service across more than 4 decades. And she is the inspiration of many Vietnamese women, myself included. And last but not least, our final speaker, Ambassador Lim Sung Nam, one of South Korea's most seasoned diplomats. He was first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Korea under the administration of President Moon Jae-in, and then he served as South Korea's ambassador to ASEAN from 2019 to 2021. And it is in that posting, sitting at the heart of ASEAN's institutional life, that makes him very well placed to offer an outsider perspective on ASEAN. And a few words about the format. Each speaker will have around 5 to 10 minutes for their preliminary remarks, and after that we will open the floor for the discussion and the questions from the floor. And without further ado, I would like to invite Kun Kasit to start. Kun Kasit.
Greetings to everyone, and thank you to all the organizers for this honor. I will give some of my observations and opinion in and around 4 documents. First is the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, TAC. Second, the ASEAN Declaration on Southeast Asia as a zone of non-nuclear. Third, the Southeast Asia, ASEAN Declaration on Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And fourth, the ASEAN Charter. In order to explain how should ASEAN go about in the current China-US rivalry. Starting with the Treaty of Amity, I would like to claim that the existence of the various ASEAN dialogue partnerships with many of the friendly countries, including the sectorial dialogue and so on, as well as the ASEAN Regional Forum, are part and parcel of this Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. I would like to claim that. And if so, then I would like to propose that, then why not ASEAN start a dialogue with the Quads, with the members of the AUKUS, with members of all the trilateral security arrangements ongoing at the moment, with the United States as the anchor. But not only to the dialogue partners of, say, the so-called free world and so on, but ASEAN should also start to have a dialogue with 2 civilization states, namely China and Russia, the twin pillars of the world at this point in time. And why not for ASEAN also to have a talk with the new alliance between North Korea and Russia? All of these entities, I think, somehow have the obligation to tell the world at large and also to inform ASEAN in particular what, sorry for the word, language, what the hell are they doing, to the world at large. And it is also the right of ASEAN to approach and to ask for information, because all of these entities, members and so on, are operating in and around the territories of the combined ASEAN, both on land and sea and in the air. It's just simply good manners, mutual respect for one another, that ASEAN should be informed. Not that ASEAN would like to exert its desire to be the architect of the regional cooperation and so on. But dialogue should ensure more cordiality and trust and more harmony. So that's on the Treaty of Amity. Let's have more talk. And one can always hold all of these meetings in Jakarta, where is situated the Secretariat, as well as the permanent representatives, missions of so many countries to ASEAN. So the platform is there. What is needed is the implementation of it. Then my second point, I would like to combine the soft and zone of peace, freedom, neutrality, and also to the spirit and letters of the ASEAN Charter pertaining to the word democracy and human rights. What is exactly my point? My point is that it's about time that ASEAN as a whole really start working very hard on the nuclear-free zone. Should be much more active collectively at the disarmament conference which failed a few weeks ago in New York. But should heed the call of so many NGOs around the world and the successful story of the conclusion of the agreement on banning the nuclear weapons. And also to pay heed to the calls of the Mayor for Peace and the World Without Nuclear based in Hiroshima. I was a year ago appointed by the Mayor for Peace as a special advisor. And I take this responsibility very seriously. And ASEAN, maybe one of the first regional organizations to have come out with a definite position on the nuclear-free zone. But little work has been done. There is a need for a more active undertaking. Then the three words, peace, freedom, and neutrality. ASEAN should be the entity of peace. It has the ASEAN Regional Forum, the Treaty of Amity. Then why not? It has no military power to harm, threaten, or hurt anyone. And Southeast Asia, throughout 1,000 years of history, practically the only region in the world where 4 major religions came and have been able to live in peace and harmony. No religious strifes, hatred. And religions coming from the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East, from Northeast Asia, came into Southeast Asia through peaceful method of being attached to the traders and so on. It's a beautiful thing, not to be forgotten, but to be remembered. And for ASEAN to tell the world the extraordinary achievement of Southeast Asia as a whole, as a land of peace and harmony. A demonstration of the ability to be able to live together in spite of the differences of the colors of the skin and the religious beliefs and so on. So ASEAN should work for peace. It has the track record of being so. Then on freedom, it's no longer the question of fighting for freedom, for independence, for sovereignty. That was completed a few decades back. My concern today It's not about the freedom, independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of the member states. It's about the freedom of ordinary citizens of the ASEAN community. Getting rid of communism, getting rid of colonialism and so on, doesn't give the right to the elites, to the status quo seeker, to the privileged few, to hold on to power and deny ordinary citizens of ASEAN the basic human rights, namely freedom. And I would like to see freedom taking place in Laos, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Burma. And what any conservative elements remains in various other member states of ASEAN. And in that sense, I dream and I hope that there will soon be the transformation of the whole of the ASEAN community, of all the member states, in the direction of democracy and human rights. I would like all my Vietnamese and my Laotian friends to be free as I am, or to be free as we are. That's very important. Then the last point, neutrality. I'm also for the realization of this dream, objective, aspiration. Neutrality, and maybe the better word, non-alignment. ASEAN should be itself as a neutral, non-aligned entity, without fear, without hesitation. It doesn't have to take side. It doesn't have to be allied to any other countries. Alliances means dependency mentality. ASEAN should not go in that direction. Being non-aligned, being neutral, I believe that it is an asset. It's a self-preservation, and it is a fortification. And in that sense, ASEAN must work not only on the democratization process, but as well as to be on itself independent, taking the neutral route, friendly to all, speak to all, and also be the bridge, as well as be the forum for all the antagonists to come together and work for peace and harmony and common prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kun Kasit. You have highlighted three keywords of peace, freedom, and neutrality as the three, I would say, key goals and aspirations that ASEAN has been working on all along, based on the classic instruments that we have built, as well as the ASEAN mechanisms that have been established for many decades, including the TAC, the Schonfest Treaty, as well as other ASEAN-led mechanisms. The question is how to leverage and improve the effectiveness of these mechanisms and instruments towards these roles. And you also mentioned your hope that one day other so-called more conservative ASEAN members like Laos and Vietnam would be transformed towards greater freedom. I think that is a very revolutionary idea within ASEAN political culture, given its fundamental principle of non-interference. But on that, I would like to invite later comment from Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh. But to continue with the conversation, can I turn to Pak Marty for his intervention. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ibu Tiha, for giving me the floor, and really pleased to be here this morning to continue our conversation on ASEAN-related matters, especially on the theme suggested to us, namely placing ASEAN within the context of China-US relations. Clearly, we can't view or approach the issue of ASEAN, China, and the United States in isolation. You have to look at it within the broader context. ASEAN or China-US dynamic is only one of the many challenges and opportunities that ASEAN is facing collectively as a region. For instance, at the risk of oversimplification, looking from Southeast Asia outward, we can see almost a perfect arc of instability around us. To our west, developments as far afield seemingly as in the West Asia, we are now clearly reminded how impactful it can become. The conflict, the US action in Iran, and the implications, the closure of the Hormuz Strait has had a tremendous impact on ASEAN's economy. Further up north, if my geography is correct, relationship between China and India, not much often discussed, is also potentially impactful to ASEAN. Relationship between China and Russia, and then further afield, Northeast Asia. Here in Northeast Asia, almost a perfect storm is constantly before us. And given the importance of the economies of Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia, what happens in Northeast Asia matters to us. Further down, East China Sea, the Strait dynamics, South China Sea. So almost a perfect arc facing us. And to the east, in the Pacific, we are seeing tests and prodding by China on the long present US preponderance or dominance. And of course, within Southeast Asia itself, we have situations such as Myanmar, the South China Sea portfolio that's still to be managed. In other words, yes, US-China is important, but it's only one of the many dynamics that we have to contend with. And I'd like as well to place in the context of our discussion what I had shared yesterday, basically the importance for ASEAN to try to manage change and to try to manage and celebrate our diversity. I think that's a constant refrain. And fortunately, I think ASEAN in the past has had a transformative capacity. We have been able not only to respond to developments, but actually adopt a more proactive approach, not simply reactive. And if you were to cite again the points that Kun Kasit mentioned, you realize how forward-looking some of these ideas were. The idea of SHONFIS, the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, ZOPFAN, in a way that reflects ASEAN and in its early years that was a little bit more passive, if that is the right word. It's more about neutrality, not wanting to choose. But then we became a bit more emboldened. We offered the concept of the TAC, non-use of force between countries in solving problems, and we tried to extrapolate that notion beyond Southeast Asia, because we asked for the accession by non-Southeast Asian states to that type of commitment. In other words, broadening the zone of peace, the idea of peaceful settlement of disputes. And in other sessions yesterday, we talked about, there was a session about Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, for instance. By the way, in ASEAN, notwithstanding the label, we have actually practiced Indo-Pacific reality. The ASEAN Regional Forum, I saw Gareth before in this room, but anyway, the ASEAN Regional Forum, for instance, the East Asia Summit, RCEP, those are beyond ASEAN, beyond Southeast Asia, beyond East Asia footprint. So notwithstanding the label who initiated the term Indo-Pacific, in practice, ASEAN has actually implemented that type of vision. So the problems are beyond China and the United States, but ASEAN, fortunately, has been proactive, transformative. Even, for instance, in the latest development in the Gulf, in West Asia, the consequence of the existence of foreign military bases in and around the main theater of conflict. All the way back in 1967, ASEAN, in its charter, already underscored that the presence of foreign military bases are temporary in nature, and they are not meant to be used against one another. So this was all the way back in 1967. And that idea is still relevant today. It just shows how prescient we were. The idea of non-use of force. I think that's even more relevant today. We have many problems, many disputes, but if we can agree to solve this, to manage this peacefully, not peacefully, not necessarily peacefully, but through political settlement, that already has a decompressing impact. And Sean Fish, Kasit already mentioned before. I made a big mistake as a person, as a policymaker in the past, and I regret doing so in trying to promote Sean Fish. Perfection was sought in the sense that we wish to have a collective accession by all the nuclear weapon states all in one go. We were so close in Cambodia 2012, everyone was on board, but then suddenly, just on the eve of signing, two of the nuclear weapon states informed that they wished to have a declaration accompanying the accession, and that sort of opened up all kind of issues, and we missed that window. And thankfully, I had suggested since then we should move incrementally, one nuclear weapon state at a time, and I heard that China is on board to sign on. I hope it will create like a positive competitive dynamic for others to rally and join as well. But anyway, the point I wanted to say, US-China is not the only challenge. There are other ones, and thankfully ASEAN in the past has been transformative, proactive, and thinking ahead of the curve, so to speak. But as we are just now, ASEAN, China, United States, as Kasit had said, a typical refrain or typical statement would be, we don't wish to choose. I personally feel the choice is not between the countries. It's not between the United States or China. The choice is between our posture, our alignment, our disposition. Are we about the idea of balancing? Are we as ASEAN simply join in one of the coalition, one of the so-called major power in their competition, becoming almost like a junior partner to one of them? Or are we bandwagoning, going along to get along, or even passive neutrality, which I don't subscribe to any one of those, because even neutrality to me is just waiting for things to happen, equidistant, guaranteeing irrelevance, because then you basically say, we are guaranteed to be in the middle of you all, so don't bother to find out what we really think about ourselves. So in the past, at least in the script that I had in my mind, is about pursuing equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium. Basically, the mindset is about inclusion. All these countries, we put them in one room. Yes, US-China dynamic is still there, but it's diluted. It's no longer the main ingredient in the pot. So that's why right from the beginning, we were insistent, for instance, that Australia, New Zealand, and India should join in the East Asia Summit, you may recall. Because otherwise, an East Asia community based on only ASEAN +3, we know that we will be left behind because the +3 are so dominant economically. And China probably within it will be quite a strong element as well. That's why we had India, New Zealand, and Australia in the pot, not to balance, not to counter China, but simply to dilute and to create fresh dynamics. That is why we had Russia and United States join at the same time. And RCEP as well was meant to deal with the problem of APEC by having India join right from the beginning. But in other words, the point that I wanted to say is that essentially we need to have our own script, and the idea of managing relations between China and it's not us choosing between them. We need to make ourselves indispensable to China and the United States. Thank you very much, Swa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Marty. You have again emphasized your very important emphasis on the issue of the notion of equilibrium of influence among all the major powers, and that may be the best pathway forward, or continues to be the best pathway forward for ASEAN in navigating the increasing contestations among the major powers. And you have also referred to different ASEAN instruments, the TAC, the SHONFES, as containing the transformative capacity for ASEAN to navigate change. The question is whether ASEAN can continue to bring forward that transformative and adaptive capacity to engage major powers at a time when these major powers have become more inclined to use their own power and resort to unilateralism rather than being committed or invested in ASEAN multilateralism. And I would like to move on to the third speaker, Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh. You have the floor now.
Thank you. Honorable Ministers, dear participants, I would like to apologize for not being able to be on site, but I'm quite attached to the Jeju Forum for Peace and Prosperity, which I have attended several times. I'd like to start my remarks by emphasizing that the global and regional context we're facing is more challenging than the Cold War bipolarity context that we had to face. In a sense, then, it was more predictable, and for us, then in the non-aligned movement, it was much more actionable too. Today, it's more complex and less predictable. This new bipolarity definitely, I think, is a challenge. The first challenge, of course, is to resist any pressure to have to choose. And I believe that overall, ASEAN doesn't want to choose. I may misread this, and I wish to hear from my ASEAN co-participants, but I don't think ASEAN members want to choose. And they definitely want to develop a posture that is proactive and not simply responsive. And among ASEAN assets in the current global and regional context, I think I would like to stress its, let's say, proactive adaptability, its positive accommodation, maintaining its core principles of unity in diversity and consensus decision-making. But if I may provide the example of Vietnam's defense policy is four no's, which it adopts while having also entered into a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US. In other words, it seems to me that combining the two would be quite typical of the type of proactive flexibility and agility of ASEAN member countries and of ASEAN as a whole in coping with, in addressing the evolving geopolitical, geosecurity context. In other words, ASEAN has been showing caution, adaptability, and resilience. But here I'd like to bring up an aspect that has not been emphasized enough in that it is part of security, and that is the economy and trade growth of ASEAN. After all, ASEAN is now the fifth largest economy in the world in aggregate. Well, it matters. You know, the world, the region, the broader region will look at us differently. And so over time, we know that our trade volume with China has reached over $1 trillion, while the one with the US is accounting for some $500 billion. So with regard to trade, the economy and trade today as are part of the security framework and picture. You cannot speak about security today only in terms of defense. You have to factor in economy and trade because they do impact. If you've got less money, you can't buy more weapons, right? So the economy and trade matter. And in the context of how we relate as a group and separately as nations to those two leading powers or superpowers, economic superpowers, well, we stand to gain if we manage to achieve a realistic balance between free trade and managed trade. This is an issue that we have, most of us, but including Vietnam in particular, we have had to deal with recently. And I don't count that as being outside the broad security framework. We have to factor in economy and trade as part of the modern security equation facing countries. Obviously, you know, if I may say, you know, Timor-Leste doesn't yet have the same kind of issue that Vietnam has when the way it trades with China and the US, having managed to manage the trade that we have with China and the US, I believe has a security aspect to it that we have to look into. The third point I'd like to make is that within the Indo-Pacific region, ASEAN retains a distinct neutral, positive, and convening or facilitating role, including in the security and defense spheres. We are nimble, flexible, but as Minister I think was NATALEGAWA mentioned, we are proactive. After all, we are, I think, an interaction space where we can convene just about everybody. Just let's remember the East Asia framework, the Shangri-La dialogue based in Singapore, and more recently, since 2010, the ADMM Plus format, which since then, 2010, brings the ASEAN defense ministers together with 8 external dialogue partners from across the broader region and further out, to New Zealand, India, Australia, and the US, and of course China, Japan, and India. So, in other words, as I remember a certain writer in Europe, well known, I mean, if ASEAN was no longer to be, we would have to recreate it in the current, global and regional context and circumstances. ASEAN has a proactive role to play. And as I said, a very distinct, neutral, positive, convening or facilitating role that cannot be replaced by any other outfit or body in this region. So, in other words, we are facing headwinds, but I believe we are facing them in a, let's say, self-confident, flexible, proactive manner. So ASEAN is here to stay, healthy, positively contributing to peace, security, and the greater good of the region, the Southeast Asian region, but the larger East Asia region, together with all the powers that are involved and interested and connected to those regions. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, and you have highlighted one of the necessary characters for us to move forward, which is proactive adaptability. And Vietnam is often considered in recent years a success story in managing and balancing the relationships with both the US and China, thanks to its consistent and persistent exercise of proactive adaptability. But of course, that has not come with difficulties. Actually, we are now under great pressure from the Trump administration because we are right there in the middle between the US and China in terms of the trade relationships. And Vietnam was slapped initially 46% of the reciprocal tariffs, and now it went down to 20%, and it remains the only country in Southeast Asia, major economies, that has not entered a trade agreement with Trump administration. Just because of that. So going forward, the pressure of being in the middle between the two great powers only increase. And with that, I would like to move on to our last speaker, Ambassador Lim Sung Nam, please.
Well, thank you so much for Mr. Hong Tian for moderating this timely and interesting session so efficiently. I'd like to begin my talk basically by asking 3 questions. Number 1, what will happen to the world? What will happen to the US-China rivalry in the coming years, especially in connection with the reactions or the role of ASEAN? The second question I'd like to ask is, what could ASEAN do to enhance its relevance, enhance its efficiency, and improve its effectiveness? And the third question I'd like to ask is, what ASEAN and Korea could do together in response to the changing global strategic environment? As an answer to the first question, I'd like to ask another sub-question, which is, what would have happened to Southeast Asia without ASEAN in the midst of the US-China strategic rivalry? maybe Southeast Asia might have become more fragmented, more divided, and the fault line between the US and China might have been much more deep-rooted and much more clear-cut without ASEAN. So from the perspective of Korea, if I look at Southeast Asia from the perspective of Northeast Asia, I basically envy Southeast Asia. Maybe if we had something like ASEAN in Northeast Asia, we might be faced with much lesser problems than we are dealing right now. And then if I look at which country, I mean among the US and China, which country is more visible, carries more weight in Southeast Asia, the answer definitely is China right now. If you look at trade statistics, China has been ASEAN's #1 trade partner since 2009, followed by the United States. And in terms of political presence, if I recall correctly, President Biden came to Southeast Asia only twice, which means he attended 2 out of 4 summit meetings with ASEAN. And President Trump came to ASEAN just once during his first 4-year term. Of course, he was in Malaysia last year to attend the ASEAN summit, but his purpose was rather to fulfill his political ambition of bringing an end to the regional disputes, for instance, between Cambodia and Thailand. So we will see whether he will be coming to Manila again this November. But all in all, I think the survey conducted by ISEAS, where Ms. Huang Tia is serving, has clearly showed that China has been winning against the US in terms of the public opinion. There is a very famous question in that public survey which asked about 1,000 Southeast Asian experts and security intellectuals what country they would choose if there is a choice only between China and the United States. And this year, if my understanding is correct, the answer for choosing the US was 48%. And the China, of course, did win something like 52%. And I was very much surprised that in Singapore, the number was even much smaller for choosing the United States over China, which was 34%, if my understanding is correct. Maybe Ms. Huang Tia could correct me if I'm wrong, or could provide some more explanation in that regard. Then the last question is the game over in Southeast Asia? No, it's not over yet. I don't think China has been fully trusted yet as a regional leader in that part of the world. And that kind of uncertainty, that kind of instability will continue, not just in Southeast Asia, but also globally in the coming decades. Maybe we might need another session, how long this kind of uncertainty would last. In my personal view, it would last another 20 or 30 years. And the second question is, how could you improve your relevance? How could you enhance your efficiency? Maybe I'm an outside observer. I could be bolder. I could be more courageous. And I have basically 3 suggestions. Number 1, as everybody knows, the term for each year's chair of ASEAN is just 1 year. That means every chair of ASEAN is looking at many challenges and problems within the time frame of 1 year. And that means their vision or their action programs will be more or less constrained by the 1-year time framework. Maybe ASEAN might want to think about the possibility of extending 1-year chairmanship to more than 1 year, so that all those visions and statements could have more meat. And number 2, I also would like to make a bold suggestion of moving from mechanical equality to substantive equality among ASEAN's member states. When I was serving as ambassador to ASEAN in the midst of the COVID-19, I was able to get a certain amount of medical assistance to provide relief for our partners, for our friends in ASEAN. The amount I was managed to get from Seoul was $5 million US, which was not small amount. But I found out later that amount was equally distributed among 10 ASEAN member states at that time. So regardless of the size of the population, regardless of how well they were already dealing with the COVID-19, every country was just getting $500,000 US. It was mechanically equal, but it was not substantively equal at the time in my personal view. So I hope there could be something ASEAN can do in that regard. Last but not least, I think ASEAN could be more vocal on maritime security. ASEAN adopted AOIP, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019, and as 4 priority areas for cooperation, it has specified maritime cooperation as #1 item. And whenever we hear talks about the maritime security or maritime cooperation in ASEAN, everybody thinks of Southeast China Sea. Of course, that's an important area. That's an important part of maritime security in ASEAN. But you also have the Strait of Malacca. And as we look back upon the war against Iran, we all remember how serious it was, how serious it is to safeguard the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe ASEAN could send a signal to other parts of the world by emphasizing the maritime security, maritime cooperation, and freedom of navigation, not just in South China Sea, but also in the Channel of Malacca. Last but not least, in terms of what ASEAN and Korea could together, I think we have been doing pretty well. The comprehensive strategic partnership established between Korea and ASEAN last year by President Lee Jae-myung and other leaders of ASEAN, I'm sure will continue to be fleshed out and continue to be strengthened. In my personal view, there is a bipartisan consensus in Korea on the importance of ASEAN as our diplomatic partner. And at the same time, I think both ASEAN and Korea have been adopting pragmatic foreign policy towards our neighbors, which means basically we have been pursuing, in my own words, a good neighbors policy towards all those major players in the region, including the US and China. So I'm sure we will continue that tradition, both ASEAN and China. But if I may go step back farther away, I'd like to make 2 more suggestions in that regard. Number 1, ASEAN and Korea should engage in much deeper strategic dialogue with ASEAN as a whole, but at the same time bilaterally between ASEAN and each and every member state of ASEAN. Because we are situated in a very similar environment. We have a lot to talk about in the format of strategic dialogue, so that we can be more open-minded and more straightforward. The last but the least question, not the least suggestion I want to make is, maybe it's time for the middle powers to strengthen the kind of the dialogue I was talking about. Maybe we might want to create something like East Asia Middle Power Caucus. I would say it EAMPC, which means ASEAN plus other middle power members of East Asia Summit, but without the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So which would mean Korea, Japan, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and ASEAN might want to create a kind of the caucus so that we can address many issues, including the US strategic rivalry, in a more straightforward manner and in a more strategic fashion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lim. And coming the affirmation of ASEAN's relevance and importance coming from an outsider is really highly appreciated. I remember that Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, the former permanent secretary of Singapore Foreign Ministry, also said the same thing, that if ASEAN did not exist, then regional states would have likely felt compelled to construct something that looks very much like ASEAN. And being an outsider, you have the luxury of being even more bold and more innovative in pushing the boundaries by suggesting that we could consider extending the ASEAN chairmanship more than 1 year. Of course, that would lead to some practical constraints about the burden on a single country to do it for more than a year, as well as the possibility of entrenching the priorities of a member state for too long. But I get what you would like to strike at, which is the chronic problem of ASEAN, which has been very productive in producing commitments and documents, but has not really delivered adequately enough on implementation. And your point about pushing for more strategic in-depth dialogues between ASEAN and South Korean leaders is a very pertinent point, and that is something that must be exercised within ASEAN itself, because I have witnessed the nature of ASEAN leaders' discussions, even within the retreat format, which has not become very not very straightforward or deep enough, because some leaders tend to just read from the prepared scripts rather than engaging in very honest and hard talk with each other. And I would like to add on a little bit, because you have asked me about the State of Southeast Asia survey this year, which shows for the second time that that Southeast Asian foreign policy security elites that participated in our survey, they chose China over the US in the very hypothetical forced question. That if you were forced to choose, then which one would you choose? And they chose China over the US at the overall regional aggregate numbers. And it is true that for the first time, Singapore and Vietnam chose China over the US, and which showed the extent of the damage to the US credibility and reputation and trust that the second Trump administration has done to itself. But I also need to qualify that this is a very hypothetical question. Perceptions are not policies. Personal preferences are not national strategy. And I still believe in what all the previous speakers have said earlier, that Southeast Asian countries don't want to choose, and what they choose is their own national interests. And still staying on that question of choice, I have a burning question that I would like to ask all the speakers here, because for many countries in Southeast Asia, I think that would apply to South Korea as well, that great power competition nowadays is no longer just a question of diplomatic positioning. It now plays out on a series of domestic policy issues. For example, what major power would finance your key infrastructure, whose technology will power your 5G and AI systems, which digital governance rules you will adopt, and where you will source your defense capabilities and arms supplies. And last year, there was a very good report from the NUS, Professor Kong Yuan Fong. The report is called The Anatomy of Choice Alignment. And in that, he argues that the strategic alignment rarely results from a single grand decision. Rather, it emerges from the accumulation of many smaller choices over time. And he cited Indonesia as an example, suggesting that Jakarta may gradually drift closer to China, not through an explicit grand strategic decision, but rather through a series of economic and diplomatic choices. For example, the decision to join BRICS and increasing economic cooperation with China. So I would like to invite the thoughts of all the speakers on this argument. Of course, ASEAN can continue to champion inclusivity and strategic balance at the collective regional level, but if member states are gradually aligning through a series of many national policy choices, then what does that mean for ASEAN's long-term unity or the absence of it? And can ASEAN still withstand external pressure as a collective, or will its member states increasingly drift in different, even further divergent strategic directions? And maybe I would invite Marty first.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't overemphasize. I'm speaking obviously as a person happily not in government, and therefore freed from any responsibility, and therefore it's just my own personal view. But you are correct as well that in underscoring the nexus, the convergence between the economy and security domain. And I also find it quite appealing and persuasive, the idea of this creeping process, not clearly defined, where a series of small decisions lead to a certain bigger outcome. I can only speak of the past, not of the present, because I'm not privy to how decisions are made in the past, in the present. But in the past, certainly we have a geopolitical antenna at play. It's not about US, China, or other economies, but certainly we are aware of our geopolitical exposures to ensure that individual decisions that we make on our economy, on our finance, on our debt, for instance, has certain threshold that we must not pass. Like a geopolitical risk register, to ensure that if we are approaching certain threshold, we must pause and ensure, for instance, diversification, or ensure we develop our own national capacity. Because otherwise we will go overboard inadvertently and find ourselves at the mercy of that country that provides us with our economic needs. In other words, we have a geopolitical lens to our economic behavior or economic activities. I'm not sure to what extent that type of mindset is being applied just now, today, or whether it's essentially purely economic numerical motivation that leads to certain geopolitical vulnerabilities. But the point as well that I wanted to make is that long before nowadays people speak about geopolitical risk, about decoupling, de-risking, but ASEAN, again, to underscore how forward-looking we have been talking about the idea of national and regional resilience all the way back in the 1980s. We have been talking about security in a most comprehensive sense, beyond defense, beyond political security issues, but about the economy, about socio-cultural resilience, all the way from back in the 80s. And now it's become a current issue again. It just shows how prescient we have been and how forward-looking. But certainly I can't speak of the Indonesia of today, but Indonesia of the past, definite geopolitical lens. In some cases, we have to say thanks, but no thanks, because we know we will pass a certain threshold. But that requires domestically within Indonesia itself, a foreign ministry, for instance, that is the conductor of foreign policy-related issues. But if there is like a lack of coordination and lack of cohesion, then every ministry to themselves, then I can foresee a situation as described where a series of small decisions or separate decisions lead to a certain suggested geopolitical outcome. It's about geopolitical antenna, which I hope is still being practiced today, but I'm not privy to it yet.
Thank you very much for your very frank sharing of your thought. I also would like to hear the views of Kun Kasit and Ambassador Lim as well. But we can start with Kun Kasit first. You are the two treaty allies of the US, but of course with very different circumstances. And maybe Kun Kasit, you can start first about the accumulation of policy choices at the domestic level that can eventually land your country in a greater alignment with one great power over the other.
Sometimes we make the unilateral position of a country quite interchangeable with the common ASEAN thing. I think in my answering, I want to make a clear distinction between an ASEAN member state posturing and the common ASEAN position. That is the first point. Second, my thesis is that I believe that ASEAN survival, stature, respect, and so on, should be on the basis of being a non-allied entity. And by extension then, the implication is that then Thailand would have to end all the military security bilateral arrangement with the United States, because most of this agreement and so on and legacy of the Cold War, anachronism and so on. There is no need, and at the same time, Thailand is no longer the frontline state as it used to be during the Cold War. The frontline state at the moment is the Philippines. And whether the Philippines has been thinking about ASEAN togetherness or not, I'm very much in doubt at the moment, because the Philippines is going all the way with all the bilateral and trilaterals and so on. I would not be surprised if they were to be offered as the 51st state of the United States. But my point is that ASEAN would be able to protect the Philippines better than the Philippines keep on increasing military alliances and networking and so on. That's my thesis. And I want to go for the collective undertaking of ASEAN as a non-ally entity. Okay, I rest my position at this point in time, because if we are not going to be together, then will we be picked one by one. And we have already seen that Laos is completely under the control of China. Cambodia, with the Riampot military facilities at the very nose of the Thai border, the upcoming Jeju Canal linking the Gulf of Thailand to southern Mekong, pressing and harming both Thailand and Vietnam at the same time. Then the military junta in Burma coming more and more under the control or influence of China. Then one by one will be picked up. And it's better that we work collectively. Why do we have ASEAN? Precisely not only to increase our well-being, lessen the internal conflict, but also to protect ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Kun Kasit. I wish we had a Philippine representative here to explain to us whether he or she would believe or has enough confidence in ASEAN to protect the Philippines enough that it doesn't have to, look elsewhere, either the U.S. treaty alliance as well as, the ongoing unilateral coalitions of security that the Philippines is exploring and implementing in the region with Australia and Japan and other U.S. allies in and outside of this region. And I would like to invite the views from Ambassador Lim as well.
Well, Professor Nguyen Phuong Khun and I were trained at the same institution in the U.S. And from a kind of academic perspective, I'd like to challenge his approach. His reasoning is basically inductivist reasoning. Because country has adopted policy A, B, and C, at the end of the day, the country has no choice but to adopt policy D, which is more or less in line with the previous commitments. But if I look at the question of why a certain country makes a specific policy choice at a given time, I think the biggest factor in explaining that policy choice in a country like Indonesia, which is completely democratized, is because of the benefits that decision will bring to the people in general. For instance, when I visited Indonesia a couple of years ago, I did ride the high-speed train between Jakarta and Bandung, and which was built by Chinese, and which was excellent. So, when China could bring those benefits to a country, the policymakers will be kind of inclined to tilt toward that direction. On the other hand, I think the United States was not really bringing those visible benefits to the country, to the people in the region. So I would rather explain the question you raised from the perspective of what benefits were brought to the country. And in that regard, what was the game between China and the US in the region? That's point number one. And point number two, if I recall what was done by Indonesia vis-a-vis China, I do remember a couple of years ago, Indonesian coordinating minister for maritime issues did explode Chinese fishing vessel in the ocean, which was arrested by Indonesia because it did infringe upon the territorial waters of the country. So not all the decisions made by Indonesia were just in line of supporting Chinese foreign policy behavior.
Oh, thank you very much. One of the key critiques that I have of that index is also that it put Southeast Asia in between the US and China only, and that misses out a very important spectrum of middle, I wouldn't call middle, I call major powers or key partners of ASEAN, including Japan, South Korea, the European Union, and also Australia. And the fact that many of these countries are US allies really adds on to the influence of the US overall, and in that index, it only shows the US and China without all of these, major powers in the middle. And I think that is a very key limitation of the index itself. Madame Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, would you like to have share your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think that earlier in my first presentation, I didn't go deep into our four-nose defense policy. I think that it is worth looking into. This four-nose defense policy, stated very clearly, obviously should not be perceived as not engaging any outside powers. We do engage outside powers. It's on what basis, principles, along what lines of approach and action we engage, those major powers. As I stressed a bit earlier, it's not because we have the four-nose defense policy, which I don't know whether any other ASEAN member country has, or are we the only one that has a clearly, explicitly stated policy, which is not geared only towards China or the US, but any, major powers that would be interested in our region and in Vietnam more specifically. I think that it has not prevented us into entering into that comprehensive partnership relationship with the US, which includes defense cooperation. In other words, that policy is not sort of preventing us from engaging, both China and the US. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is we in ASEAN, I believe, and I stress again the point I made, after all, the Shangri-La dialogue is based within ASEAN. The East Asian Summit is grounded in ASEAN. It's ASEAN +3 plus so and so forth. So in other words, I think we are on the right track, and there is no contradiction between our individual defense postures or policies and our regional engagement through ASEAN. So again, as I stressed earlier, and I would like to reiterate here, it's just that we really have to take a hard look at the current geopolitical and regional challenges that are shifting and are becoming more complex, and that might require greater concertation, not consultation, thinking in concert to find the most appropriate posture for ASEAN to preserve, I think, what I call its unique, position and role. Frankly, tell me, compare ASEAN to EU, to OIC, to OAS, to OLA, so on and so forth. Do they have the same kind of role and impact? In other words, I'm a believer in ASEAN's, let's say, promise, if we, keep our heads really cool, take a very clear look at what's going on in the broader world and in our broader region, and frankly, the ability to engage, external but close, actors. I remember that I was involved in the Cambodia settlement process and, issue. And I remember that Indonesia, was very, forthcoming in dialoguing with Vietnam to help us, together with Indonesia in particular, Australia also, and the UN, to find a solution to the Cambodia issue. So, I mean, going back, our engagement with, members of the grouping and partners of the grouping, like Australia, I mean, we have a track record of proactive and effective engagement is produce result. I would suggest that you look at the Paris Conference on Cambodia. I was there. It's incredible. I mean, look at the list of who was there. Canada was there. Imagine, Canada was there, and, as a dialogue partner and so on and so forth. So I'm a believer in the adaptability of ASEAN to continue playing that proactive role, which accommodates both the need to lead in the region and for the region, and to accommodate our respective national, let's say, agendas and priorities.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador Tôn Nữ Thị Ninh, and I am very glad after you ended with the positive note. I am confident that the majority of the panelists here remain firm believers in ASEAN. And it is very noteworthy that this panel brings together very senior and seasoned diplomats who have been with ASEAN and actually living ASEAN by example, by action, by commitment through decades. That's why they bring with them the wisdom, the experience, and the insights of the history that can ground us with certain hope and confidence in ASEAN ability to adapt, to transform, and to continue to persevere in the challenging times ahead. This is some quality that young researchers, I'm not very young, but I think I'm still very junior, and something that young people like us do not really have very full confidence with, because we don't have that broad sweep of history. And with that quite confident and hopeful note, I would like to end the conversation here. And thank you so much to all the distinguished panelists for very generously sharing your insights and perspectives with us. Please give them a big applause. Thank you.